since this is an introductory course, the introduction to the introduction will be somewhat of a kind of, let us say, cultural history. I would like to situate the intellectual environment of the scholastics, the so-called high scholastic period. But I will do so very briefly. It will, however, be useful, I believe. So, first of all, one speaks much of the medieval Renaissance, but in fact there are three. I've been accused of illegible handwriting, I think utterly unjust. So first, first phenomenon of Renaissance, that is of rebirth, of return to antiquity, occurs prior to Charlemagne with the Carolingian Renaissance, Charles the Bold particularly, Charles II, and then after Charlemagne, that is, in the 9th century, under the Carolingian Frankish dynasty. The philosopher here is Scotus the Ariogena. A very proud Irishman, it seems, since Scotus, contrary to what you may think, doesn't mean Scottish, but in Latin Irish, and Ariogena is born of Eriu, that is, the Irish-born Irish. And the Carolingian Renaissance is really a new birth rather than a rebirth, because the cultural precedents are slim and to us still very little known. So there is a genuine revival after the long dark ages. What is properly called the Renaissance, which would be number 3, the Renaissance, it is called that the humanist Renaissance of the 15th, 16th centuries. That Renaissance is secular, whereas the Carolingian Renaissance is entirely of the feudal, really theocratic kind, as I will say a little more now. So the Carolingian Renaissance, as opposed to that later Renaissance of the 15th and the 16th centuries, is spiritual in the sense of a strong, centralized Christianity, and even Ariogena was appointed with reviving the culture of the West. I mean, he was given a mission. It was a very descendant, as well it should for a Neoplatonist philosopher, rebirth, descendant from the, in this case, the empire. The empire. In between those two Renaissances, which in a way open and close the Middle Ages. I've said several times that no one knows when the Middle Ages begin. We can either start the account of the Middle Ages with Augustine and end with Luther, and then you have over a millennium. You can others start it also with the second Renaissance, number 2, but then others locate it from Augustine until high scholasticism, so you can have between 12 and 1 centuries of Middle Age. 12 centuries if you begin with Augustine and end with the early 16th century, which is quite plausible. You end up with 1 century if you say that it's just the 13th century. So there's no convention at all. Yeah? When you say Middle Ages, you have to be kind enough to inform your interlocutor what you're talking about. Since this is Middle Ages number 2, let's say that number one began with Augustine. So I work for the purpose of the course with a large concept of Middle Ages, and then it will close obviously with the explosion of universalism in Ockham and Meister Eckhart. So, from the point of view of the problematic, of the philosophical problematic, it is more convenient to characterize the Middle Ages as, or by its enduring questions. And one would say that its underlying enduring question is the status of the universals. That explodes with so-called nominalism, the universals do, and with them the Middle Ages. The realism of universals in Christianity that is joined with a certain Christian philosophy begins then with Augustine. That is one way of arguing for the long interpretation of what the Middle Ages are. So, this second Renaissance then, scholasticism, would be, let's call it the Aristotelian, since that is the topic of the course. Aristotelian Renaissance. There had indeed been a Platonic Renaissance with the so-called Neoplatonism. And the word Neoplatonism means exactly that, namely a new Platonism, but that begins in the 4th century, unless it begins with Philo of Alexandria at first. A new Platonism, so you can even lengthen your list of Renaissances in the plural and include that one. Begin with that one. This Aristotelian Renaissance is neither primarily spiritual as the Carolingian, nor certainly secular as the 15th, 16th century Renaissance. It is indistinguishably intertwined with the discovery, or the rediscovery rather, in the West of Aristotle, brought back into the mainstream of Western culture via North Africa and the Arabs, partly translated from Arabic into Latin and partly from library of Constantinople from Greek. But that is the big event in the 12th and 13th centuries, the eruption of the texts of Aristotle, and as you may guess, that places the guiding for the purpose of finding a unitary topic for the realism of universals, places that in an entirely new light. One can no longer go on, as it went without saying, for nearly a millennium, that what is most real are universals, and the singulars, the individuals that you and I happen to be are just ephemeral fringe manifestations of universals which are solid and more real in their existence than what we observe. The Carolingian Renaissance is feudal, imperial. Charlemagne dreamt of reviving the Roman Empire. It is also, on an extremely feeble textual basis, Neoplatonist in Huguenot. So in Huguenot's text is so difficult to read, not only because it's full of contradictions, that in a great philosopher is forgiven, but not in Dante. And the other reason why Huguenot is so difficult to read is that he himself bases himself on very slim information, very slim culture, very slim learning. This Neoplatonism in Huguenot gained primarily in Irish monasteries, of which we, as I said, know little what was taught there, even what was available in terms of texts. So, finally, the second Renaissance, I say, is not only feudal imperial and not only much better informed than the first, It is also rationalist in a certain sense. Rationalist in the sense of what is trivial. What is trivial is what belongs to the trivial. Because the liberal arts, as you may recall, fall into two classes, two kinds. There are 7 arts altogether: the trivium, the 3 arts, and the quadrivium, the 4 arts. The 3, which are trivial because everyone knows them, are grammar, rhetoric, and logic. This is illegible, that's because of the palimpsest underneath. And the quadrivium consists of geometry, arithmetic, music, and astronomy. So the trivialities are those that everyone knows. There is grammar, rhetoric, and logic. And they form the basis of the joining the order of speech, that is grammar, and logic, or the whole, let's say, pars pro toto. Grammar stands for the whole of the trivialities of grammar, rhetoric, and logic. But it is primarily grammar. Of joining, I say, grammar and the order of things. So one can even draw a typology according to that disjunction, how grammar and the order of things are interrelated. For a Neoplatonist, they would be identical. That is the waxing conviction of the philosophers of that tradition, particularly after the times. That the order of nature is but the order of grammar, logic, and rhetoric, or particularly grammar, hypostatized, to use a technical term from the times. For the Aristotelians now, let's call them Neo-Aristotelians, grammar and the order of things certainly no longer be identical, because when they are identical, you have a kind of rationalism for which, then mediating very complex matters in Neoplatonism, for which there is little place for sensible substances. Plotinus says time and again, sensible substances belong to the, or they form the, or they are informed by the trace of reality. Just the trace, or the shadow, or the fringe, that is where sensible reality and visible reality occurs. And it is relegated to that fringe because of the identity claim between the order of things and the order of grammar, reasoning, thinking, speaking. For the Neo-Aristotelians, with which we will have to wrestle, primarily Thomas Aquinas, obviously, but today we will particularly make some remarks about Albert the Great, the mentor of Thomas Aquinas. For the Neo-Aristotelians, I say, that this would be a relation of parallelism. Namely, that universals have a reality, but that sensible substances do as well. So one will have to want to learn a little more about that twofold state of primary, secondary substances, as you may remember from Aristotle, but this is much revised here in ways that we will have to look at more in detail. Well, since I've started such a nice list, let's add a few terms, but just as a footnote. Because the relation of grammar and the order of things is not a minor question. One could add certainly that for moderns, one would have to put here any candidate. From modernity, that relation would be one of representation. From Kant or perhaps Luther onwards to Schopenhauer, obviously, and a few others. And then you may add your own favorite candidates. Here you may speak of the picture theory, logical forms in the early Wittgenstein, picture, elements, atoms of reality, and you may find some further items on that list. If you think hard. So, this juncture of the trivial, the things trivial, and reality, that is the great tension, the moment of tension that arises from the point of view of problems, if you wish, from the reintroduction of Aristotle into the Western tradition. The second Renaissance, but yes, by the way, there's a gaping hole in the 14th century. Why? Because there are other things in mind with philosophy. Great plague, Black Death. So that the 15th, that the Quattrocento truly was a rebirth from death. In the 13th century, in scholasticism, the Renaissance rests on two bases, and they have conveniently each a place in European geography. A rediscovery of Roman law at the University of Bologna in Italy, and a, well, not rediscovery, but rather for the West rediscovery, there's Aristotelian science of nature in Paris. You have to see, since this is meant to be an introduction of culture, from cultural history, you have to see the different setting of the Carolingian Renaissance and then the Renaissance in the 13th century, 12th centuries. The Neoplatonists of the Carolingian Empire were rural monks arguing the justification of a merely theocratic empire. The locus, the places of the Renaissance of the 12th and 13th centuries are the new towns, are the cities. And instead of the countryside, the city, and instead of monasteries, the newly founded universities. So this sociological setting changes already quite a bit the outlook. Roman law in Bologna challenged actually the theocratic aspirations. So the return to antiquity, both Greek and Latin, from the point of view of the law, was also an anti-feudal citizens' move. The return to Cicero and the rediscovery of the Roman theory of law. The justification of government then was to be based progressively on more empirical grounds. The same term of, rather than biblical, the same turn of mind attracts the physicians and scientists who want Aristotle. That is the great attraction of the University of Paris. Historical and theocratic aspirations had lost once and for all with the victory of the French King Philip II over the Emperor Otto IV at Bouvines in the beginning of the 13th century. Footnote again on what you read in the newspaper. Augustine wrote a book entitled The City of God, and distinguished between the city of God and the city of earth. And the earthly city. With that distinction, contrary to what has circulated later on under the label of political Augustinianism. Parenthesis. That means political Augustinianism means that the Pope has the power of investiture over the emperor. Political Augustinianism means that the spiritual power pushes the emperors around. But in that very distinction of cities, Augustine himself sets up a framework that is entirely against so-called political Augustinianism, since the earth is the struggle of those two empires. With this extraordinary consequence, now listen well because I want to insist on this, the extraordinary consequence that after a millennium of struggles, the earthly city can produce its own laws, namely with Newton and the revolutions of the modern state, and particularly the appearance of nation states. Well, that's in introductions, one can make sweeping statements. Here we go from the distinction of the earthly city and heavenly city to developments in modernity of politics and the autonomy, a relative autonomy, but that relative autonomy begins precisely with the introduction of Aristotle. That's why I make the point here. The relative autonomy of sciences as well as politics, which brings us back to newspapers, because other monotheistic theologies, Islam and Orthodox Judaism, have not produced that kind of distinction of two cities, and therefore have tremendous headaches, particularly Islam, of reconciling a secular science, a secular nation state with its revelation, with its holy book. And that is one of the long-lasting, that is the main long-lasting struggle within Islam, and difficulty of adapting itself to the 20th century with the back and forth between what we've seen under the Shah and then certain reversals and so on. So in that sense, Augustine, and for that matter, give Caesar, and for that matter, the New Testament, give Caesar what is due to Caesar, has at least started the development towards a relative autonomy of the earthly city. Hannah Arendt criticized in her early dissertation and then throughout her writings repeatedly Augustine for that duplicity, for that inwardness of the city, that the city of God is made of hearts, rather than of budgets and streetcars and means of production, or in her case, sidewalk cafes where you can speak up and with equals discuss about freedom. Well, it's true, but at the same time, the political sphere also becomes autonomous with that disjunction in two cities. Much impressed, of course, later, or sharpened by Luther in the 16th century. Also the doctrine of the two realms, the two realms. So, Aristotelianism, then in the 12th and 13th century, wrests at least a theory of nature from a theocratic, too strong a term, from a well, let's stick to the term from a panlogism. From a panlogism, which treats universals, as I said, as the sole reality. So Aristotelianism, the introduction of Aristotelianism in the 12th and 13th century, rehabilitates a certain autonomy of nature and of the city. Now that's not a small matter. So that we now find texts, theories of physics and of politics precisely not based on the Neoplatonic scheme of a grand deduction from a supreme principle that fizzles out up to or down to those fringes which are the state and sensible substances. That is the impact of Aristotle, the rehabilitation of the rediscovery all of a sudden of a certain autonomy, a relative autonomy, but that's the term, a relative autonomy of things natural. Therefore one has texts, one reads or one comments on Aristotle's physics, and things political. Therefore one comments on Aristotle's politics. For you who know Aristotle more or less by heart, this seems to be a triviality, what more? But in the 12th and 13th century, this was not exactly go without saying. Just as Kant, in his criticism, says, after dissection on Nomina and Phenomena, he has conquered an island of rationality, of understanding, rather, he says, des Verstandes. Likewise, in the sea of the thundering sea, as he says, Kant, to paraphrase him, of what the medievals called the lumen revelationis, the light of revelation. There, Aristotle has allowed the medievals, these medievals here, to cut out an island for the lumen naturale. And it is not the other way around. It is not that the lumen naturale is, well, first of all, what does that mean? Lumen naturale means the natural light and is a frequently used metaphor in the Latin-speaking Middle Ages for what reason, unaided by revelation, can discover out of itself. For instance, mathematical truths, but also it can discover out of itself the fact that the soul is immortal. It can discover out of itself, unaided by revelation, that God exists, hence various arguments for the existence of God. That is the lumen naturale, the natural light unaided by revelation. It cannot discover out of itself say out of the lumen naturale by natural light as opposed to revealed light, we can know by natural light that the soul is immortal. But out of the revealed light, but it takes the revealed light to know of the soul that it is well, all kinds of other things, such as saved, resurrected, with the body redeemed, things like that. That we cannot discover out of our natural light. But within the preceding, encompassing, theocentric universalism of the Neoplatonists, Aristotle helps to cut out an area where the natural light, that is reason, unguided, unaided by revelation, can reach certainty. And as I said, in political terms, this junction has been put clearly with Augustine, although not at all even in reference to Aristotle. So with the rise of the cities and the foundation of universities, Bologna and Paris and then Cologne and others, also appear new religious orders. The Neoplatonists were Benedictines, rural orders. The Neo-Aristotelians are orders in the cities. They are primarily Dominicans, as Thomas Aquinas is. The denial of knowledge established independently from religion is then only the ideology of feudal conservatism. The denial of knowledge of Lumen Naturale now appears as what it is, namely the leftover of an ideology of feudal conservatism. One word briefly about the third Renaissance, the humanist Renaissance. It develops further the drive towards scientific and artistic autonomy of this. Autonomy from faith, mainly in literature and the visual arts. The revival of Greek ideas and turns against or contests that monolithic Christianity. Other questions at this point? The second Renaissance, the Aristotelian Renaissance, is actually unthinkable without the Parisian milieu and the Latin Quarter, as it is still called. Paris is called the New Athens. There is no clearer way of indicating the Renaissance, maybe to call it the New Athens. Here is one text from the end of the 13th century about this role of Paris in learning in the High Middle Ages. I should add, I mentioned that last that Dionysius, never mind Dionysius, I'm talking about Dionysius, is a rather overdetermined figure, as they say. Number one, St. Paul says, I went to Athens, preached, was more or less picked out, not well received. There was so-and-so and so-and-so, and there was also on the Areopag, there was Dionysius. That's all we hear about him in the New Testament. Then, in the 4th century, appear a certain number of texts written by someone clever who published them under the name of Dionysius the Areopagite. In order to put them in under the pen of this Dionysius, whom St. Paul mentions, but of whom we know nothing. So that's the first overdetermination. 4 centuries apart, where all of a sudden this Dionysius comes. St. Paul is promoted to the rank of authorship of the treatise, Divine Names, and the Celestial Hierarchy. I recommend strongly that you read, it is well translated into English, of Divine Names. And he is now called, no longer Dionysius, but of course in the literature, Pseudo-Dionysius. Pseudo-Dionysius Areopagita. Now comes Dionysius number 3, who in the Middle Ages were all conflated into one. Dionysius number 3 Christianized Paris. That's why the cathedral where the French kings are buried is Saint-Denis. You take the air for and visit the tombs, the marble tombs in the crypt. That is Saint-Denis in honor of Dionysius, who converted the Gauls in Paris to Christianity. After the Middle Ages, these were all 3, were all one Dionysius. And here we go, for the glory of Paris and Dionysius. The blessed Dionysius the Areopagite came to Paris after having done his previous model, after having met St. Paul in Athens and after having met his books. So he came to Paris in order to make this city into the mother of studies in the manner of Athens. And quite as Athens, the city of Paris is divided into 3 parts. The first is that of the merchants, craftsmen, and the populace. It is called the great city. The second is that of the aristocrats, where the king's court is located, as well as the cathedral. It is called La Cité, as you have the La Cité. The third is that of the students and the colleges. It is called the university. Learning was first transmitted from Greece to Rome, and then at the time of Charlemagne from Rome to Paris, and so it goes on. So, this is to show you the locus of the cultural locus, and what is to be but there, primarily from the sociological point of view that interests you, the rise of the city, and there I refer you to an excellent book by Marie-Dominique Chenu. Two, Theology of the 12th Century, and Introduction to Thomas Aquinas. Does anyone know the exact title? I think it's Introduction to Thomas Aquinas. Marie-Dominique Chenu. He has more to say about that setting of cities, and particularly of the urban life, as connected now to Neo-Aristotelianism, to the introduction of Aristotle. Whereas Neoplatonism is a new intellectual breed, that is a new, or was, from the 3rd, 4th centuries onwards, was a new Platonism. Neo-Aristotelianism, on the other hand, since it stood for a retrieval of autonomy in certain areas of learning, at least, as I tried to say, Neo-Aristotelianism is Aristotelianism little transformed. So there's much more, despite the break of over a millennium, there's more of intellectual continuity between Aristotle and the Neo-Aristotelians of the 12th and 13th century, as when there was from Plato to the Neoplatonists of the 3rd, 4th centuries. First. And this we owe to the Arabs and to the excellence of their scholarship in preserving, translating the textbook and the library of Constantinople. Aristotle then, I say, little transformed, at least in the doctrines that first made Aristotle so attractive to a mind dissatisfied with the totalitarian rule of faith over reason, since this wave here around the island of reason is that of belief and of Carolinian feudalism, namely the areas of the trivial areas, these three trivial areas, grammar, rhetoric, and logic, and the sciences of, or a science of nature. But of course, to speak of rebirth implies imitation, obedience to ancient models. And the second of these Renaissance zones is perhaps, in some ways, the least creative in quotation marks. With the Huguenot, something entirely new begins because there was only darkness. Whereas in the 15th, 16th century, we can only bow deeply and admire in silence, particularly what they have achieved in arts and beauty. The genre, literary genre of the scholastic Renaissance is the commentary. And that tells you quite a bit of it. Note on the term authority. It will come from the verb, the authority comes from authority. Augere, which means to augment. So authority is both the auctor, that is the one who starts, who creates, and the author and authority. In English we have the same double meaning. But both author and authority augment what, let's say, meaning of something that is received. So authority augments what is received. Someone who speaks with authority augments the sense or the meaning that is received by a hearer. And the authority as institutionalized augments, that adds upon the received doctrines. The commentators of the 12th and 13th centuries then are first of all agents of augmentation, of enhancement, and of preservation of the texts and their enhancement. That is authority, preservation and enhancement. This was alluded to. Then it's phrased by Nietzsche, although in Nietzsche it means something a little bit different. So, auctoritas. But auctoritas in the 12th century means something different than in the Carolingian Renaissance. The Carolingian Renaissance is a static, hierarchical order which is served by its ideologist, namely the deductive Neoplatonist in Huguenot. Whereas authority, auctoritas, in the 12th and 13th century is an entirely historical affair. It's returning to the philosopher. Instead of saying Aristotle, we frequently simply say philosophus. The philosopher says, and then one enlarges upon him with commentaries. And that is what authority does. It itself, the act of commenting, then becomes an authority because it is literally the act of augmenting. The commentator is the augmentor, and the text commented upon is that which is augmented, and therefore has both authority and authorship. This differential exposition of Aristotle, of the philosopher, will then in turn be conceived as a scandal in the Quattrocento. So from Renaissance to Renaissance to Renaissance, in the Middle Ages, you see a progression of, I can't know a better word than emancipation. The Carolingian Renaissance is an emancipation from utter night and darkness of the Dark Ages. In the name of an idealism, the realism of universities. The Second Renaissance is an emancipation of that sense of authority, centralized, imperial, immobile, static, and philosophically deductive to the exclusion of any immaterial cause. So emancipation from that static order with the help of Aristotle. And then the great Renaissance of the Quattrocento, the 15th and 16th centuries, they will be in emancipation from this very idea of slavery to texts, of commenting and of treating authority as sacrosanct. Because they will in turn then treat the aesthetic canon of Greek antiquity and Latin antiquity as model and as definite. And this, and the way it goes on, up to and including Kant. For Kant, still there is all emancipation, all enlightenment, all Aufklärung in Kant. And in pure reason, he says the ideal of beauty in the arts may in fact have been achieved already. That is in Greece. And that's the way we still should think, even though you may see magnificent things in Soho Gallery. It is also this differential attitude also carries within it the germ of dogmatism, maybe of scholasticism precisely. So it is itself an attitude of well, as I said, differential exposition of first of all Aristotle and the Bible, obviously, but becomes quickly, or carries within it, because of that very sense of augere, of augmenting, it carries within itself an authority, and therefore turns into a body very quickly, namely that of scholasticism. It becomes a school of commentary. We thus are faced with the paradox that the return to Aristotle was animated by the passion of more pure air, more rigorous methods, greater autonomy for natural reason, or reason out of its own resources, in particularly the area of reflecting about politics and nature, but that the so-called school over the century, on the other hand, came to stand more and more for the contrary of such fresh air. But the air was fresh in the 12th century. It was an extraordinary new beginning of and discovery of capacities that the mind had, which, under the sway of idealism, let us say, of Panlogism, of the Neoplatonists, went unsuspected. I mean, the mind could produce out of itself, for instance, rules for the analysis of nature, and that it did not need descending justification from an ultimate reference point in order to know those trivialities which are grammar, rhetorics, and mathematics. Fresh air, or such a threat. The beginning of scholasticism was such a novelty, such a daring gesture of reclaiming reason's autonomy, that the great scholastic, the greatest of them all, Thomas Aquinas, was condemned in the year of the Lord 1277, not to be forgotten. The first reaction of the Church to Thomas Aquinas was a papal bull condemning him and condemning a certain number of theses, 1277, only to take all back and canonize him and then make him the official teacher of it. But you have to see the impulse of giving to reason a certain autonomy, which was indeed something new. In the 16th century, in the time of Luther, Cajetan, a disciple of belonging to the same order as Thomas Aquinas, was then brought into line to knock hard Luther, who was perfectly capable of knocking back equally hard. So then we have the debate between a sclerosed scholasticism and a new beginning in the 16th century. Quite as in the 13th century, the Church condemned Aquinas' Aristotelianism as dangerous, so the offspring thereof, Cajetan, the scholastic, the Thomist, condemns Luther in the 16th. The medieval rationalist genius is such that it has to rely on a text, on a document, on something to comment on, an auctoritas, be that religious or not. And as I say, and this will be the topic of this course, that auctoritas to rely on is, in the areas that interest us, Aristotle. But this reliance, as we will see, by no means precludes entirely new thinking. It is the deed of medieval Aristotelians to expand some of Aristotle's intuitions into an entirely new context, which would have made Aristotle proud. Just think of four out of the five so-called ways of proving the existence of God. Four of them are Aristotelian, and all four, more or less, all four more or less rely on the principle of motion, motion, which in turn can be reduced to the observation, or to the conviction that what is not moved by itself must be moved by another. What is not moved by itself, indeed. What is not moved by itself must be moved by another. And the physics that delineates the areas of techne, where substances are moved by another, namely maker, from the area of physis, nature, where substances are moved by themselves, namely they grow by themselves. That's an Aristotle. Delineation between technique When we do something, kick a football, or make cars or statues, so their things are moved by another, delineated from the area of nature where things are moved by themselves, namely via chlorophyll and blood. Now that Aristotelian disjuncture in 4 out of the 5 VA arguments, let's say, reasonings for the existence, about the existence of God, proofs to say much. That in 4 of those 5 arguments, the tenet or the axiom, one is not moved by itself, must be moved by another, serves to prove that the whole world does not move by itself, therefore must be moved by another. Therefore it is out of causality in one way or another, for, lastly, that the first mover is proved to be creator. But that is an application that Aristotle would have rather frowned on. I only give this as an example of the expansion of Aristotelianism in this appropriation. Other questions?
Why would he have frowned on it? Why would he have frowned on that appropriation?
That is the question about the difficult relation between 3 things in Aristotle. The first mover, the self-thinking intellect, and then the principle of nature, physis as self-producer. Because physis is not only a delineation of an area as opposed to techne, as I've said, but I cannot say everything at the same time. It is also, physis is also an agent. I mean, it's an active principle. Phye is first of all a verb. So we have 3 candidates here as mover, namely physis itself, and physis is treated as an archae throughout as the first thing in the physics, together with some archaic, which then come in the plural, or the first mover, which is entirely has a different role, and then the third candidate is the self-thinking intellect. But the way they are integrated, arranged in order to serve the proof of the existence of God, I say that is something that Aristotle would have just not, he would not have seen, he would have frowned on, he would have been puzzled by the monotheism. The monotheism in the service of which these 3 intuitions of physis, or I should rather say phyein, nature moving itself, the prime mover, and then the loose thinking itself, are blended into an argumentational process. To Boethius in the 4th, 5th centuries, only 2 texts of Aristotle were known, which he translated, the Categories and On Interpretation. Until the 12th century, nothing else was known of Aristotle. Only the Categories and On Interpretation. There was another text that circulated as by Aristotle. This confused everyone and should confuse you horribly. Namely a book entitled The Book on Causes, Liber de Causis, which it seems, or it seemed, since it seemed no longer to seem, was a compilation from to make things not completely confused, from the scholastic of Neoplatonism. Namely, the last Neoplatonist, before the dark ages, was Proclus, who really writes like a scholastic, but there the term used in quotation marks. Namely, takes from his predecessors, primarily Plotinus, insights and formulates them in a body of propositions. So, one hypothesis is that the Liber de Causis, which circulated under the name of Aristotle, was a collection of excerpts from Proclus. Therefore, you see how confused this Aristotle was. I mean, what a strange figure he was. The arch Neoplatonist Proclus was the author of something that the high scholastics in the 13th century, Thomas Aquinas, had his doubts about the authorship of Aristotle in Liber de Causis. But in the 13th century, they thought that this arch Neoplatonist that was written by Aristotle, which shows you that Aristotle until then was hardly more than the name for someone who had written the doctrine of the Categories and Periameneias, the interpretation. Then, within a century and a half, the entire Aristotelian corpus becomes available in Latin via the Arabs. And what is of great, what set it all off, what set up this discovery that I'm trying to belabor of a relative autonomy of reason, where legs and knees and hands, that is the parts of the animals. That is what struck Albert the Great. The parts of the animals, created by Aristotle. Translated there from the Greek by William of Murbeck. So, here is a quote from Albert the Great, a mentor, as I said, of Aquinas. In matters of faith and morals, one has to believe Augustine rather than the philosophers. This is Albert the Great speaking. In question of medicine, I trust Galen and Hippocrates. And concerning the nature of things, it is of Aristotle that I ask advice. End of quote. This is a very nice distribution of competencies. Augustine is the auctoritas for things theological and moral. Medicine, Galen, Hippocrates. That's not it. But concerning the nature of things, so it is for Albert the Great, the physics, in particular the values animalium, on the parts of the soul, of the animals, in which reason begins to rely on itself, and in which the authority is Aristotle. Until 1250, the rest of Aristotle, other than the organon and the physics, is still considered dangerous, namely dangerous to faith and morals, where I should stick with Augustine. That's what Thomas Aquinas then breaks loose from and gets knocked out of the fingers. Together with the emphasis on logic, the Aristotelian legacy that disrupts, that is my point, the Aristotelian legacy, as it returns into the Western tradition, disrupts the unity of philosophy and religion. That's no small matter. To repeat it, the germ of a certain autonomy of nature and reason was laid with Augustine and the New Testament in the political sphere. The city, the earthly city, possesses a certain autonomy. But the doors for the autonomous exercise of reason swung wide open when nature itself became, or could at least be thought of, as understandable out of itself rather than as iconikos, rather than as an image or a copy of something more real. That's what Aristotle brings to the 12th century. That nature can be understood out of itself, out of its own principles of motion, rather than of a sphere separate from visible nature and that persists everlastingly above it, which is of an ideal order, which is the sphere of idealities. That is the way, that is the Neoplatonist way of understanding nature. To understand what is lower, you first have to understand what is higher. Neoplatonist axiom. If you have understood what is eternal properly, then you can also understand by deduction or disimplication, understand what is lower. I spoke with the advisor to Mitterrand on urban planning a while ago. It was to mid-80s, I think the people are no longer around the authorities, I hope in class. He was an architect, and I said there was a discussion about how architects are trained in France. I said, well, we do a lot of sociology, and quote now, as long as your political thinking is correct, the expression in materials comes by itself. Materials, that is concrete, stone, wood. Now that is a beautifully deductive axiom. As long as your idealities are correct, the expression in materials. I was asked about how treat steel and glass and people, they learn all this. But as long as you have the idealities straight, the ideologies state. Then the expression materials comes by itself. But that's a pre-Aristotelian naturalism. And that is something what in its context in the 12th century, the reintroduction of Aristotle precisely blows asunder. Namely that it is enough to know the order of idealities in order to understand nature. Hence, the excitement of Albert the Great in reading the physics, namely that physis, that nature, can be understood out of itself and not as reflection or model or copy of an order that is eminent, excellent, and above it, and its archetype. So the physical world then becomes intelligible in itself. So the philosophy starts or begins to break away from the auctoritas of faith and the concomitant realism of universals.
Is there a parallelism between reason and an intelligible physical world opposed to a revelatory beyond discursive reasoning, like in parallel
Well,
invisible ideology?
Things are more complicated than I can sort of in a clear-cut position say, because what we will see much in detail for the Aristotelians, it remains true that what is more universal is also more intelligible. So this is not this relative rehabilitation of the autonomy of reason. It's not to say that the intelligibility of nature is self-sufficient, but rather what is intelligible in nature are its archai, its principia, and they are of course universals. So this is not to say that we here have some kind of empirical science of nature. That's certainly one more step, and to be taken much later. Not as much later as you think, because the nominalists will of course be the first to argue for experience. So the translators are Bartholomew of Messina and William of Mürbecke, who translates magnificently. And at the beginning of the Latin period, the great translators were Boethius and the same Cicero, but here in the 12th century, Bartholomew of Messina, William of Mürbecke, and one has to add Robert Grostet. Robert Grostet. So there is a direct reception from Aristotle, from the Greek, via Constantinople, and an indirect one from Greek into Syriac, into Arabic, and perhaps into ancient Spanish, and then into Latin. Other questions? Yes?
You said that the Islamic world has some problems because they didn't have an Augustine there postulating three gods or six cities. But they were the ones who brought in Aristotle.
Yes.
And so, and you're also saying that Aristotle had expected the scholastics in medieval time to focus on nature as kind of an autonomous sphere.
Yes.
But didn't have that effect in the politics.
Yes, that is the case. That both, I've used the two areas. I mean, in politics it is obvious and more obvious every day. That has always been said, I mean, it's nothing new. That Islam does not have, because it is theocratic by its very impulse, does not have a space for a secular theory of the nation state. Therefore, the great headache of nation states, there are Islamic nations, and perhaps there's one Islamic nation, but the nation states are something entirely artificial and in fact accepted from outside. As to Aristotle and the other sphere of the autonomy, the relative autonomy of reason in this Western tradition, of which I said that it too, Islam does not have a space, is that of the study of nature. Are you perfectly right in saying, wait a minute, how come they make on one hand such a big deal of Aristotle, preserve him for us, study him, are the best students before these letters, namely Avicenna, Averroes, of precisely the philosophy of nature of Aristotle. And the answer is that it's not appropriated, it's not something that has carried fruit in an autonomous development switch, the history of efficiency. It has not produced, could not produce any furtherance or appropriation of a philosophy of nature. I made those remarks in the broad overview of progressive emancipation through those three moments of the medieval Renaissance towards the eventually that entire path, although Aristotle was present, that entire path remains unfollown and must remain unfollown for Islam. It's ahead of it because of the encompassing authority of faith.
They have political writing?
Excuse me?
Do they have Aristotle's political writing?
Yes. Yes, so in that sense there too, it remains example, but never corresponds to any experience else. For instance, in the theory of natural law and Thomas Aquinas, in the second part of the second part, extraordinary treatise on natural law. The starting point is the practice of customs in medieval society. And in the practice of customs, how the feudal lord is bound to, by an oath, his vassals, how that functions. From there, Thomas Aquinas shows the reality of natural law that is always obeyed in custom, in what at least we call nomos in the broadest sense. And he then goes on to show how in Aristotle's politics that natural law is rooted. Such an itinerary for Islam is unthinkable, because the practice of law of interaction always stands governed by precepts, wonderful though they are, some, others not so, as regards.
Were there any texts that were not known yet to the scholastics that later became known to the rest?
Not that I know of.
You made the distinction between authorities for morality, which was Augustine, medicine, Hippocrates, and the reality of things for Aristotle. Does that hold true? Yeah. Does that hold true throughout the period that we're going to study, or does one segment have priority over the others? For instance, where do they appeal for the ultimate authority on a question, whatever it is? Would Scripture be more have higher priority than, Aristotle?
No, that division of labor, the division of authorities remains true. This is a big question you're asking. But to make it short, with our natural light, with its natural light, reason can discover, without revelation, without the help of faith, a great many truths, which until it was prompted by reading Aristotle, it didn't know it could discover. This does not mean that these great many truths, grammar, rhetoric, logic, and natural and political truths, quite a few left there, no? Grammar, rhetoric, logic, physics, and politics. That does not mean that although we discover truths in them with our own sweated effort, that they are not, in a total view of things, subordinated to God, of course. So that subordination eventually will put them all into place. As it does in Augustine, the earthly city strives historically towards the city of God, and there's all kind of there's struggle, there's fight, but eventually the city of God will vanquish. I stop with that example, the city of God will vanquish, which shows you the eventual subordination of the city of earth, but not in the sense that I alluded to earlier, or so called political Palestinian. Now I would like to step out with the help of Albert the Great, the three areas that I will also cover in this course, the plan of this course. Namely, we will first deal with problems of identity and difference in medieval ontology. I will come back to all these. Then we'll consider problems of the soul in connection with knowledge. and then we will come back to the question of universals. So I go through those three briefly, leaning on Albert the Great. Albert is the one who introduces the Aristotelian corpus into philosophy. He begins. He is the one who's really struck by what Aristotle has to bring. Therefore, he's called Doctor Universalis, universal teacher, also because of his own immense culture and writing. And his disciple Ulrich of Strasbourg calls him Nostri temporis stupor et miraculum. Nostri temporis stupor et miraculum. Which they have today. No, stupor, no. What's the word? He is stupefied. But stupefying is not enough.
Awesome.
Yes, but it's a noun. You have to find something. He's the awe, let's say, the awe. And miraculum, and the miracle of our time. Nostri temporis stupor et miraculum. That's Albert the Great. Because he was, first of all, so awed by Aristotle himself. And primarily in the following three themes, which seem to be decisive for the entire neo-Aristotelian advance, or a real zoom forward, the neo-Aristotelian in the 12th century. First of all, the active intellect. So we come now to one part of Aristotelian theology. Albert identifies the Christian creator God with the Aristotelian active intellect, following therein Averroes and Avicenna. And that was, in fact, for Averroes and Avicenna, for the Arab Aristotelians, what was most attractive in Aristotle, speculations of thought thinking itself. There's the subsisting intellect, the active intellect knowing itself. But for an Aristotelian, something entirely heretic is introduced when Albert says, the intellectus universaliter agens, the intellect that is at work universally. That universally active intellect causes so this is the self-thinking intellect, and I put a circle there in order to show that it thinks itself. And here, listen. This universally active intellect causes the first created intelligences to exist, like a fountain, which in turn create all things visible. We have here a beautiful syncretism of Neo-Aristotelianism and Neoplatonism. Because it is the self-thinking thought of Aristotle that in its reflexivity creates what all medievals will call intelligible substances, ideas, in the sense of unvariable forms. If you have read Scotus Eriugena, this is the distinction between first and second natures. And these forms, in turn, create things visible, what Eriugena called third natures. So there you have a beautiful case of inserting an Aristotelian intuition or insight or concept, namely that of self-thinking thought, into a Neoplatonic architecture of universals and their causality by mimetism, but their mimetic causality, and the causality by imitation. From this first created intelligence, from these first created intelligences, he says, emanated, that's his term, in degrees. So this is more complicated still than just one bubble over this fountain. Emanated in degrees through the world, the soul, all things down to material beings. So this is then a very nice case of mixture of traditions, and in the case of Albert the Great, due precisely to the fragments from a Neoplatonist source collected in the book called Book of the Causes, Liber de Causes. Since it was meant to be Aristotle, well, the Aristotle that comes out must go rather Neoplatonist. Also, Albert states explicitly, quote, "You have to know that man will never become perfect in philosophizing unless by the science of the two philosophies, that of Aristotle and that of Plato." So this is a syncretistic program in Albert the Great, which Aquinas will not follow. He will treat, it's nice to look at the sobriquet, that is the nicknames that one gives, the people give. He calls Aristotle the philosopher, but of Plato, he speaks usually in the plural. He says, the Platonists say. Those over there, the Platonists, Catholici. But the Platonici are opposed to the philosopher. This crown there. But that's not, of course, what in the spirit of Albert the Great. Albert the Great, after the shock of receiving Aristotle, that tries to amalgamate things and says, I repeat the quote, "You have to know that man will never become perfect in philosophy unless by the science of the two philosophies, that of Aristotle and that of Plato." The reason why, and the enormous consequence of, the reason why Albert brings in the self-thinking intellect instead of the one, as the Neoplatonists say, resting fully immobile in itself. The reason why Albert brings in the self-thinking intellect and replaces with it the one, in which there is no life, is in order to be able to account for life within God and for the creation. In other words, to break up the ontological monism of Neoplatonists, where it is one being that appears shaded or graded throughout the world, throughout the layer of universals and particulars eventually. So the concept of an active intellect is introduced by Albert to break up the monist conception of being, and that the being of the first intelligence is in itself moved, is in itself alive, turning upon itself. So the Aristotelian metaphysics is used to counter a univocal notion of being. This will remain a hot item, it will become hotter still in the late 13th century with Scotus. And Scotus's new thesis of univocity of being, which plays a different role, however. But it is for the sake, well, put it strong, schematically at least, to replace the one resting in itself, Monet, as the Neoplatonists call it, self-resting, one resting in itself. Replace that with the intellect thinking itself, understanding itself, in ontological terms allows for an analogy of being. Because it is no longer the one that appears more or less degraded literally throughout the levels of reality, but the intellect thinking itself produces layers that are truly other. So it accounts for true otherness in reality. To put it simply formally, in that the first cause is its own other in thinking itself. That's what reflection does. It constitutes itself as its own other. It then can also produce ranks that are other in being. Hence, an analogy of being that is the relative autonomy of other degrees of being, and not only the appearance of one first being more and more shaded or weak according to its descending particularization, as would be the case in Neoplatonic traditions. So it is the homogeneous, it is this anagogical continuity. Anagoge, assent the anagogical continuity of being. As you rise, think of think of Diotima. As you rise towards what the Neoplatonists call the one, also the good, but preferably the one, there is a continuity of being that is the same being that appears, but that anagogical continuity is broken up in the following way, as Albert explains it. He refuses that homogeneous word representation, saying, some held that all things are one. Pentapanta, and all things are one. And that the diffusion of the first being in all of them is their being. Now, those some can be many. They can in a way be Heraclitus and Parmenides, but there certainly are the Neoplatonists that being is one and its diffusion. The Latin term is quidam dixerunt omnia esse unum, that all things are one, et quod diffusio, well, English is very clever. The diffusion, that is the sharing, the distribution. Diffusio primi omnibus est esse eorum, that is the sharing, the self-communication of the first being is the being of the others. In other words, they have no autonomous being, but they come to appear as the first being distributes itself, shines out, proceeds, goes forth, to use some technical terms from that tradition. So some held that he says, that the being of the first is the being of all other things, and tapanta, all things are one, inasmuch as the first shines out. Some, and those some are the ones that Aquinas will call the Platonists. And that is what he denies now with recourse to various texts from the Aristotle's Things on the Soul, namely the Anima 3.5, on the active nous and the active intellect, 3.5, where Aristotle describes that it is that the first intellect is unmixed, unaffected, creative and autonomous, and this is read together with the 7th and 8th books of Aristotle's physics, 7.1 and 8.5 and 6, about the unmoved mover. So in Albert the Great, then there is this syncretism from Aristotle opposed to a monist conception of being, or what I call an anagogical continuity of being throughout the layers of reality. Other questions? You can, to repeat that part, you can grand scheme of ontology and describe what Albert the Great learned from Aristotle. Was such an enormous shock, opposed to the Neoplatonist immobile schema. The Neoplatonists refers entirely motionless. Only the individual soul moves upwards in its descent. So what Albert has learned is the constitution of otherness in the first principle. The constitution of otherness in the first principle. And that can be spelled out in many ways. But the most convenient is that which perhaps Averroes and Avicenna have used so beautifully, namely the self-reflection of the first. The constitution, the originary constitution of otherness, occurs then in such an intellectualist ontology through self-reflection. Because the first reflects on itself, is intelligence, there is otherness in the first principle. That is the Arab way of speculating about identity and difference. The creationist way would look in Aristotle much more to the physics, books 7 and 8 that I've said, about the unmoved mover and the constitution of otherness according to the pattern of techne. What is not moved by itself must be moved by another. So the constitution of an otherness in that the first principle creates. But that's another otherness than the otherness of the self-thinking intellect. wasn't the self-thinking intellectualist tradition, the intellectualist Aristotelianism. The otherness is the mind for itself. Whereas in the creationist Aristotelianism, the otherness is that of what is created, moved by poiesis, produced in other words, created. And that will be much more at the heart of Thomas Aquinas' view of Aristotelianism. The idea of other, me, introduces difference into this ontology of identity in neo-Aristotelian. The quote from Albert that I read shows that clearly. The appropriation of the rejection of the Neoplatonists who held that things are one. Thus, although the reasoning about creation is carried out in the scheme of emanation here in Albert, the concept of otherness is at its very starting point, and therefore the construct of processions is displaced. It's placed into a different area, different sites, and different context. And therefore opens the way to my first topic, which I will begin with next week, namely that of the analogy of being, the doctrine of identity and difference in being. Second, briefly, the status now of universals. On this point of the universals, it's sometimes Peter Abelard, who is called the first believer Aristotelian on the status of universals. He mediates between an extreme nominalism, later Occam, and holds that only individuals exist. He mediates. So Abelard's doctrine of universals stands midway between a nominalism for which universals are only flatus vocis, only breath between your teeth, and on the other hand, between what preceding millennium has taught, namely that universals are what is most real, that only common natures are real. Ever since Abelard and Albert the Great, Aristotelians will say that, and this you should remember by heart, because it accounts metaphysically for the autonomy of substances, substantiae simpliciter diverse. Substances are purely and simply diverse. And it also accounts for experiences such as ultimately death, but also solitude. Substances are purely and simply diverse, therefore all bridges between them are accidental. But if substances are simpliciter diverse, then one cannot say that universals are all that has truly being. Rather, that which has first being is the substance. Otherwise, the substances, plural, would not be simpliciter diverse, purely and simply diverse. They will therefore distinguish between three loci, so to speak, three pieces of universals. And this is, and you develop this further also, ante rem, the universal prior to the thing, and that is prior in the order of thinking, namely that it exists as in the mind of the maker. So the universal ante rem is the specific essence or specific nature of the thing that must exist independently of its realization, not in time, but in priority. The nature of the thing, or the essence of the thing must exist independently of its realization, otherwise the thing will not appear. Or, then second, in re, and that is the universal, let us say here, essence, and the universal in re is its form, and post rem is the universal qua concept. Concept abstracted from the thing. It exists after, the universe exists after a thing, namely in that in cognition, I abstract from an individual substance its form, the form as constant. Now to conclude briefly on the third point, the substance of the soul. So the second was the status of universals. The first, the doctrine of analogy. Doctrine of analogy, and with it the possibility of identity and difference, in which Neoplatonists have sacrificed difference to identity. Second point, which I will develop in this semester, is the status of universals. And third, the substance of the soul. The first side, the Christian philosophy, that remains within the realm of the subject matters assigned to it by faith, seems to be bound by a Platonizing conception of soul. In other words, it will have to be able to say something about the soul's immortality and relative autonomy, so that it can then, in addition, through the light of revelation, say that soul that exists independently by itself also knows a certain history, namely of lapse and of redemption. If the soul is immortal, it cannot simply be understood in the Aristotelian fashion as the form of the human body. But at that point, Aristotle himself is more Platonist than one would think, simply from the highly morphism, doctrine of matter of soul, in this case as form. Since